This 1906 photo of a mining family seems simple until you notice the girl's gloves don't fit. It looked like any other portrait from the Appalachian coalfields. A father and daughter posed outside their company cabin, the hills rising dark behind them. The kind of image you might find in a county history book or framed in a small museum, captioned with something vague about the hardworking families of coal country. But one detail refused to stay quiet. And once you see it, the whole picture changes. Margaret Ellison had been cataloging photographs for the West Virginia State Archives for nearly 15 years. She had processed thousands of images from the coal era, the same parade of grimy faces, timber frames, and coal tipples repeating across decades, most of them blurred together after a while. This one should have been no different. A miner, still in his work clothes, sits on an overturned crate outside a weathered plank cabin. On his lap sits a girl of maybe 8 or 9, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression somewhere between tired and wary. Her father's hand rests on her shoulder. The composition is ordinary, the lighting flat. Margaret almost filed it without a second glance, but then she noticed the gloves. The girl was wearing work gloves. That alone was unusual for a portrait. Children in these photos typically wore their best clothes, or at least their cleanest ones. These gloves were leather, stiff and oversized, the kind miners wore to protect their hands from jagged coal and splintered timber. They swallowed the girl's small hands completely, the fingers flopping loosely, the cuffs bunching around her wrists, and on the right glove, just below the thumb, there was a dark smear. Coal dust. Margaret leaned closer to her monitor, adjusting the scan's contrast. The stain was unmistakable. This was not a costume. These were not dress-up accessories borrowed from her father for a playful photo. Someone had worn these gloves into a mine, someone small. Margaret sat back in her chair and stared at the image for a long time. In 15 years, she had never seen anything quite like this. Something here was wrong. She had come to the archives by way of graduate school in Morgantown, where she had written her thesis on documentary photography of the New Deal era. After that, she had taken what she thought would be a temporary position, cataloging a backlog of uncategorized materials, and then she had simply never left. The work suited her. She liked the quiet, the precision, the slow accumulation of small discoveries. Most of what she found was mundane, but occasionally something surfaced that made the years of routine feel worthwhile. This photograph had arrived as part of a large donation from the estate of a collector in Charleston. The collection was mostly postcards and stereoscope cards, the sort of thing tourists bought in the early 20th century. But tucked among the mass-produced images were a few dozen original prints, and this was one of them. Margaret pulled on a pair of cotton gloves and removed the print from its protective sleeve. The paper was thick and slightly buckled, the surface matte. She turned it over carefully. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Harding Hollow, 1906, Jeremiah Combs and daughter." Below that, in different handwriting, was a single word, "Paid." She photographed the inscription, then examined the front again under a magnifying loupe. The cabin behind the pair was small, maybe 2 rooms, with a single window covered by oiled paper. A tin bucket sat near the door. The father's face was weathered, his eyes deep set, his beard untrimmed. He looked older than he probably was. The girl's face was harder to read. Her mouth was set in a thin line. Her eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the camera. And those gloves. Margaret could not stop looking at them. She set the print aside and opened a new search window on her computer. If the inscription was accurate, she had a name, a location, and a year. That was more than most of these photographs offered. It was enough to start. Harding Hollow turned out to be a company town, one of dozens that had sprung up along the coal seams of southern West Virginia in the late 19th century. By 1906, it was owned and operated by the Allegheny Fuel and Iron Company, a mid-sized concern that controlled several mines in the region. The town itself had been built in a narrow valley, the houses stacked along a single unpaved road that followed the creek bed. The mine entrance was at the head of the hollow, the coal tipple and loading tracks just below it. Everything in Harding Hollow belonged to the company, the houses, the store, the church, even the cemetery. Margaret found Jeremiah Combs in the 1900 census, listed as a coal loader living in the Harding Hollow district. He was 32 years old. His wife, Sarah, was 28. They had 3 children, a son named Thomas, age 10, a daughter named Opal, age 4, and an infant son named William, age 1. By 1906, Opal would have been about 9, the right age for the girl in the photograph. But something had happened between 1900 and 1906. In the 1910 census, Jeremiah Combs was still listed in Harding Hollow, but his household looked different. Sarah was gone. So was William. Thomas, now 20, had his own entry as a minor, and Opal, age 14, was listed simply as daughter, with no occupation recorded. Margaret pulled up what death records she could find for the county. Sarah Combs had died in 1903, cause listed as fever. William had died in 1904, at age 5, cause listed as consumption. By 1906, Jeremiah Combs was a widower with 2 surviving children, working one of the most dangerous jobs in America. She kept digging. Allegheny Fuel and Iron had left behind a scattered archive, some of it held at the State Library, some at a university collection in Pennsylvania, some apparently lost. But Margaret managed to locate a microfilmed set of company payroll ledgers from the Harding Hollow operation, covering 1904 through 1908. She requested the reel and waited. While she waited, she reached out to Dr. Thomas Braxton, a labor historian at Marshall University who had written extensively about the West Virginia coalfields. She emailed him a scan of the photograph and asked if anything about it struck him as unusual. His reply came within an hour. "The gloves are the first thing I noticed," he wrote. "That's not a studio prop, that's work gear, and the staining pattern is consistent with handling raw coal. I've seen this kind of evidence before, but rarely in photographs. Most of it comes from accident reports and company records. If this is what I think it is, you've found something significant." Margaret asked him what he thought it was. "Substitution labor," he replied. It was more common than anyone wanted to admit. The microfilm arrived a week later. Margaret threaded it into the reader and began scrolling through columns of names, dates, and tonnage figures. Allegheny Fuel and Iron paid its miners by the ton. Each man was assigned a numbered tag, and each car of coal he loaded was weighed and credited to his account. At the end of each week, the company calculated what he had earned and then subtracted what he owed: rent, store credit, equipment charges, fines. The fines were everywhere. Margaret had read about the fine system in academic papers, but seeing it in the raw ledgers was different. Men were docked for short weight, for impure loads, for damaged equipment, for unauthorized absence, for failure to meet quota. Some weeks the fines wiped out a man's entire earnings. Some weeks they left him in debt. She found Jeremiah Combs's entries starting in September 1904. His output was steady through the fall, then dropped sharply in December. A note in the margin read, "Arm injury, tunnel 3." For the next 6 weeks, his tonnage was recorded as 0, but his debts continued to accumulate: rent, store credit, medical fee, fines for missed quota. Then, in late January 1905, his numbers started climbing again. Not all the way back to his earlier levels, but enough to keep the debt from growing. Margaret checked the dates against what she knew of his household. His wife had been dead for over a year. His younger son had just died. His older son, Thomas, was 15, old enough to work legally in the mines. But Thomas had his own entry in the ledgers, loading coal under his own tag number. So who was producing Jeremiah's coal while his arm healed? Margaret scrolled forward, week by week. Jeremiah's tonnage stayed low, but consistent through 1905 and into 1906. In April 1906, there was another note: short weight penalty, night shift. She paused. Night shift. Allegheny Fuel and Iron ran 2 shifts at the Harding Hollow mine, the day shift and the night shift. The night shift was smaller, less supervised, and almost entirely off the books. She called Dr. Braxton. "Night shift was where the worst abuses happened," he told her. "Foremen looked the other way because the company wanted the coal and didn't want to pay for extra supervision. Injured men who couldn't work would sometimes send a substitute, a wife, a brother, a child. The company didn't ask questions as long as the tonnage came out." Margaret looked at the photograph on her desk, the girl in the oversized gloves. Opal Combs, age 9. "How common was this?" she asked. Common enough that it shows up in the testimony from the 1907 Senate investigation into mine safety, Braxton said. Miners described sending their sons into the tunnels at night to avoid being fined for underperformance. A few mentioned daughters. The committee noted it but took no action. The companies denied everything. Margaret asked if there was any way to prove it from the records. Not directly, Braxton said. The companies kept their ledgers clean. But there are patterns. If you see a miner's tonnage drop after an injury and then partially recover without any change in his work status, that's a sign. If you see night shift penalties attached to someone who is supposedly disabled, that's a stronger sign. And if you have a photograph of a child wearing coal-stained work gloves, that's about as close to proof as you're going to get. Dr. Braxton suggested that Margaret visit the site. Harding Hollow was gone now, abandoned after the mine closed in the 1930s. But the land was still there, and so were the records that hadn't made it into official archives. Local families had kept things. Churches had kept things. Sometimes the most important evidence was the kind that never got cataloged. Margaret drove down to the southern coalfields on a Friday in late October. The landscape was beautiful in a scarred way, the ridges thick with autumn color, the valleys still marked by the terraces of old slag heaps. She met a local genealogist named Earl Sizemore at a diner in the county seat. Earl was in his 70s, a retired schoolteacher who had spent the last 2 decades collecting oral histories and family papers from the coal communities. He knew the Combs family. Jeremiah's line died out in the 1950s, he said. Opal never married. She lived in a boarding house in Beckley until she passed in 1962. But her brother Thomas had children, and one of his granddaughters still lives over in Raleigh County. Name's Denise Combs Porter. She might talk to you. Earl also had something else. He reached into a battered briefcase and pulled out a photocopy of a handwritten letter. It was dated March 1907 and addressed to the editor of the United Mine Workers Journal. The signature at the bottom read, J. Combs, Harding Hollow. The letter was short, written in rough but legible script. Jeremiah Combs described the conditions at the Allegheny Fuel, an iron mine, the long hours, the short pay, the constant threat of fines and eviction. He described his injury and the months of debt that followed. And then he wrote a sentence that made Margaret's hands go cold. They know about the children. They say nothing, because the coal keeps coming. When a man cannot lift his pick, someone must lift it for him, or the whole family is put out. My girl goes in at night when the foreman is drunk. She is small enough to crawl where the men cannot. God forgive us all. The letter had never been published. Earl had found it in a box of unsorted papers donated to a local historical society years ago. It had been misfiled with unrelated correspondence and forgotten. Margaret asked if she could make a copy. Earl nodded. I figured you might want to, he said. I never knew what to do with it. Didn't seem right to just leave it in a box, but it didn't seem right to put it out there without context either. That afternoon, Margaret drove to Raleigh County to meet Denise Combs Porter. Denise was a retired nurse in her 60s, living in a tidy ranch house on the outskirts of Beckley. She welcomed Margaret cautiously, unsure what to make of an archivist showing up with questions about her great-great-grandfather. Margaret showed her the photograph first. Denise studied it for a long time, then set it down on the kitchen table. That's Opal, she said quietly. We have another picture of her, taken later, when she was grown. Same eyes. Margaret asked if Denise knew anything about Opal's childhood. Only what my grandmother told me, Denise said. She was Thomas's daughter, so Opal was her aunt. Grandmother said Aunt Opal never talked about the hollow. Never talked about her father either. She just worked, saved her money, and kept to herself. Grandmother said she had a bad cough her whole life, said it started when she was young. Margaret hesitated, then showed Denise the letter. Denise read it twice. Her expression shifted slowly, from confusion to recognition to something harder to name. We always knew something happened, she said finally. There were stories, whispers. My grandmother used to say that Aunt Opal paid for the family's sins. We never knew what that meant. She touched the edge of the photocopy. Now I think maybe we do. When Margaret returned to the archives, she began assembling her findings into a preliminary report. She had a photograph, a ledger entry, a letter, and oral testimony from a descendant. She had expert analysis from a labor historian. She had the context of a system, designed to extract maximum profit from the most vulnerable workers. And at the center of it all, she had a 9-year-old girl in gloves that did not fit. She brought the report to her supervisor, a deputy director named Richard Hargrove. She explained what she had found and what she believed it meant. Hargrove listened carefully, then asked to see the photograph again. "This is compelling," he said, "but it's also going to be controversial. We've had donors from coal families before. Some of them are still active supporters." Margaret said she understood. "I'm not saying we bury it," Hargrove continued. "I'm saying we need to be careful how we present it. The photograph itself is ambiguous. The gloves could be explained other ways. A child playing dress-up, a posed novelty shot." Margaret pointed out the coal staining, the letter, the ledger patterns. "All circumstantial," Hargrove said. "Suggestive, yes, but not proof beyond doubt." The meeting ended without a decision. Margaret went back to her desk and sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about Opal Combs, who had spent her adult life in silence, who had never married, who had died alone in a boarding house with damaged lungs. She thought about the company foreman who looked the other way, the executives who set the quotas and the fines, the system that made a father send his daughter into the darkness because the alternative was losing everything. She thought about what it meant to let that story stay buried. A week later, she sent an email to Dr. Braxton and to a journalist named Claire Mendelson, who had written a series for a regional magazine about forgotten labor abuses. She attached the photograph, the letter, and her preliminary report. She asked if they thought the story was worth telling, even if the archives hesitated. Braxton replied first. "This is exactly the kind of evidence that needs to be public," he wrote. "The coal companies spent decades sanitizing their history. They turned exploitation into nostalgia. If you have the documentation, you have an obligation to let people see it." Mendelson replied the same day. "I want to write this," she said. "Can we meet?" The article appeared 3 months later in a publication called Appalachian Voices. It ran with the photograph on the cover, cropped to emphasize the gloves. The headline read, "The Girl Who Worked the Night Shift, Child Substitution Labor in the West Virginia Coalfields." The response was immediate and polarized. Some readers praised the piece for finally acknowledging a history that their own families had whispered about for generations. Others accused the author of exaggerating, of slandering the coal industry, of exploiting tragedy for attention. A few descendants of mine operators wrote letters of complaint. A state legislator called it irresponsible revisionism. But something else happened too. Other photographs began to surface. Readers sent in images from their own family collections, children in work clothes, children with blackened hands, children standing outside mine entrances in the early morning or late evening light. Some of the images had notes on the back, some had no identification at all, but the pattern was unmistakable. This was not an isolated case. It was a system. The West Virginia State Archives announced a new initiative to collect and catalog evidence of child labor in the coal era. Margaret was named the project lead. Denise Combs Porter agreed to serve on an advisory committee representing affected families. At Offer, the project's first public event held in a community center in Beckley, Denise stood before a crowd of nearly 100 people and spoke about her great-great-aunt for the first time. "Opal Combs was 9 years old when she started going into that mine," Denise said. "She did it to keep her family from being thrown out of their home. She did it because a company decided that a man who couldn't work was worth less than nothing. She carried coal in the dark so her father could keep a roof over their heads, and when it was over, no one ever thanked her, no one ever told her story. She just disappeared into history like it never happened." Denise paused and looked out at the audience. "We're here because it did happen, and because it happened to a lot of children whose names we'll never know. The least we can do is stop pretending it didn't." The photograph now hangs in a permanent exhibit at the State Cultural Center in Charleston. The caption is longer than most. It names Opal Combs. It describes what the gloves mean. It explains the system of fines and quotas that forced families into impossible choices. And it asks visitors to consider how many other portraits from the coal era might be hiding similar stories in plain sight. Because that is the strange thing about photographs from this period. They were meant to project stability, respectability, order. A miner and his daughter posed outside their cabin, looking directly at the camera. The image says, "We are here, we are surviving, we are a family." But look closer. Look at the details that do not quite fit. The hands, the clothes, the objects held or hidden, the expressions that do not match the pose. There are thousands of photographs like this in archives across Appalachia. Most of them have never been examined closely. Most of them are filed under headings like coal families, or mining communities, or rural life. They are used to illustrate chapters in history books, to decorate museum walls, to fill out documentary montages, and in almost every case, the story they are asked to tell is the story the companies wanted told. Hard work, simple living, the dignity of labor. But the photographs themselves often tell a different story. If you know how to look, if you are willing to see. Opal Combs was not the only child who wore her father's gloves into a mine. She was not the only daughter who crawled through tunnels too narrow for a grown man. She was not the only young life ground down by a system that counted coal by the ton and families by the debt they owed. She was one of many. And for every child whose photograph survives, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose faces were never captured at all. The camera, in those years, was a tool of the powerful. It recorded what the powerful wanted recorded, but sometimes, by accident or by defiance, it also recorded what they meant to hide. A smear of coal dust on a child's glove, a pair of hands too small for the work they were doing. Detail that refuses to stay quiet. All it takes is someone willing to notice, and someone willing to ask what it means.